Very fancy. All right. Without further ado, let me introduce you, Sydney Carafa, talking about the narrative of test.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. This is the first talk I've ever given, so excuse me if I reference my notes. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see it? Good. Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk about building a quality narrative. First, I want to start with the problem. One of the biggest pain points I've heard across the testing community and also in my own experience is showing the value that testing or quality roles bring to an organization is incredibly difficult. And it can lead to burnout, frustration, or even layoffs. And that's just my own experience. I know how much value our roles bring, and I see the work that we do every day and the value that we bring every day. But over my career, I've seen that value proposition disappear as it gets to higher levels of leadership, especially. Visibility is definitely a complex problem that will look different across organizations, but I think you can implement different strategies to improve visibility of work in the organization. So, what is the quality narrative? Basically, it's just taking all the pieces of work you do and packaging it in a way that tells a story of the value of your work. As people, storytelling can be a really valuable way to package impact that may not be completely quantifiable. A lot of the work that we do can't necessarily be translated to numbers or data, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. We can quantify a lot of things, code coverage, bugs reported, errors traced, that sort of thing. There's a lot of work we do that's not quantifiable. All the time you spend doing bug triage or management, documentation, process improvements, those things aren't really trackable by numbers. We can use those activities in combination with quantitative data to tell a story of how we create impact across different pillars. So, how do you do that? Um, Develop a framework. So, deciding what your main areas of impact are, identifying communication opportunities, and emphasizing and communicating within that impact context. So, testing roles can vary pretty drastically, company to company, person to person. It's actually one of the things I love about the industry and these roles is like the nebulous role description can lead to some misunderstandings about the work that we actually do. This is something I've been wrestling with for a while, especially after I was laid off. And it became the macro version of a micro problem I had been facing in my own job search. How do I tell my story in a way that's compelling and encapsulates the value that I bring to the market, which has been very challenging. Um, the way I worked through this was essentially developing what I called my three pillars of impact, which highlighted essentially the three main areas of impact with my work, which would be test architecture, process design and optimization, and product quality. This is all based on work that I've done in my previous organizations and my most recent one where the quality department was eliminated. And, unfortunately, we didn't have the alignment of the value we brought to the company at those levels. So I want to start with the easiest one. The most obvious one is product quality, right? Obviously, we do a lot of work in this area, exploratory functional testing, writing test scripts, facilitating bug bashes, filing bugs. All those things are really good examples that we are very aware of. Um, but some things to think about, that are could also fall under this category example would be things like documentation. Are you writing product or feature documentation? Are you creating test data? Do you manage bug backlogs or bug triage processes? Are you identifying product requirement gaps? Do you create internal educational content or trainings? All those things can kind of fall under building up product quality. I wanted to share some examples from previous work that I've done that would fall under these different categories I've pulled. The first one's what I call a quality plan. Essentially, my goal with creating this document was to have a singular source of information that project leadership could go to sort of see all, not only just like test information, but the high level quality work that I was doing to sort of facilitate quality across the entire SDLC. So what I included in these were essentially like risk and mitigation strategies. I would link to different testing documentation. Those are typically super in depth and not necessarily what project leadership wants to see. They don't necessarily want to read through, you know, 6 different tabs of Excel spreadsheets of all the different test scenarios for some feature. They don't necessarily need that. But linking to that work can be helpful just for visual purposes. Um, and bug bash documents, bug bash schedules. I included rollout strategies, which would include like the day of collaboration between like what the engineers need to do and that process and the type of work and the system that we were working in, we had to roll out. We couldn't do like 0 to 100 essentially. We had to roll out to percentages. And we also had like a long-term rollout strategy because we had multiple cohorts of customers. And those also included for the day of like observability metrics we would turn on. Um, this is where I took the opportunity to add test automation and code quality improvement opportunities. Twofold purpose there. One, to highlight, the changes that we could make that we knew we needed to make eventually to make improvements here. Removing dead code, increasing automation in certain ways, and even like bug fix opportunities because we were already going to be in the area of the code base, certain bugs existed, those kinds of things. The secondary purpose was to have this work documented for future reference. If this comes up, if a bug becomes a bigger issue in the future, then I could point back to this and say, well, this was an active decision we made to not prioritize fixing this. And, that this is sort of a good way to build some of that historical content. I also created like an embedded feature bug triage list just to track the kind of bugs that we were reporting through testing. And then I included a list too of existing bugs that were at risk increase in customer reports based on feature changes. And that's just an analysis that I did. Um, and then I created a condensed version for executive leadership because we had some high level eyes on that, and that was even shorter. And it basically had like what the high level release criteria was because we knew we were going to not fix everything that came up. So, how was that decision made? And then the risks and mitigation strategies, the feature bug triage list, and the rollout strategy. And those were for the big decision makers essentially. Um, there are also examples outside of the SDLC. So even beyond feature development, there were things that we were doing to better the product I was working on. So developing a quality dashboard. I ended up providing a monthly report about the general state of like the health of the system I was working on. So I combined essentially the bug data from the quality dashboard with observability metrics and provided that monthly report. That's also where I would include, some ad hoc other work that I did, like updating dashboards or adding new metrics or updating monitors. And then as I continued to do that, I started adding basically a rate of change. If there were changes in like performance or bug increases, so I would include like a top 5 list of our bugs with the highest customer reports and what the rate of change was month to month. And then at the end of each report, I asked for feedback. I found if I asked people for feedback on the information I was providing and I asked them to tell me what they wanted to see, I increased the engagement I had with that content. And these were focused on like engineering managers and directors essentially that were reading these, but asking for feedback is how I really got a lot more engagement than I was seeing before I was asking for feedback. Thing I do want to highlight with these pillars is using impact-driven language. Another thing that came through my job search is changing the way I framed a lot of the things that I've done. So, if you're creating and maintaining documentation, you're doing that, but through doing that, you're also standardizing practices across engineering teams or improving team understanding of XYZ, improving project outcomes because you're, clarifying these things through documentation. With creating test data, You're enhancing team efficiency because you can test with high quality data. You're enabling engineers to focus on feature development instead of having to build out test data. Um, Creating internal education content and trainings. You're, again, driving team understanding and adoption of tools and processes, communicating feature changes, and enhancing team readiness. Those kinds of things can be really helpful in really communicating that impact in a way that doesn't require necessarily sheer numbers. Next pillar is process design and optimization. As I've grown in my career, I've realized I often did a lot of work in process optimization I didn't even realize. It wasn't really until I designed something I was calling like the post-launch feature analysis that I realized how much impact I could make in that area. But these are some good questions to ask around process design. You know, what bottlenecks have you identified and addressed in the SDLC? Have you created processes that enhance collaboration or efficiency? Have you implemented tools or processes or standards to make collaboration and feature development more efficient or effective? I, again, wanted to share some examples from my own work, but the post-launch feature analysis is where I really thought about this a lot. I started developing this essentially to provide a mixture of quantitative data and some qualitative data I got after we launched a large feature. So I included a section that had some quantitative data. So those were things that we're tracking in my quality dashboard. So it was like the number of bugs we fixed before the release and the number of bugs we knowingly released, and any changes in system reliability or performance after the release. And then I included two other sections. One section was, technical issues and proposed solutions, long term or short term. So we had some challenges with, for example, creating test data took an extremely long amount of time and it was a very manual process. I'm talking, I spent countless hours creating test data and updating test data and making sure it was updated across all these different microservices we had. And so I had put in, a long-term proposed solution of being able to create like an API endpoint where we could have a set of inputs and variables that we could then hit that endpoint and say, I want, X amount of users with randomized inputs and variables. But then I also included a section of process issues and proposed solutions. And I got this information essentially from talking to people throughout the SDLC. And this could be a part of a retro. The issue that I saw for the projects we were working on is that the retro typically only included an engineering team and possibly the PM. But the people who are working across the whole feature development cycle were more than that. We had, a design team, we had customer service input, we had all these other people that had points in the SDLC to actually develop the feature. So we weren't getting the full idea of what the full process actually looked like and what improvements we could make. So here's some problems we actually came across that are pretty easy problems to fix. So like one problem we had is engineers working on outdated design and product documents and having to do a lot of rework. So the issue here was that the design team had their own process, and then like the product and engineering teams had their own process. And so when documents were updated, they weren't updated in the same places, and engineers weren't keeping up with that work. So really, the solution is just align on what the single source of truth is going to be across all departments, and all updates are made there. Um, we also had an issue where there were a lot of open decisions and decision points that were being missed. And that was something we actually solved like in real time in the software development lifecycle, just setting up a simple Slack automation, requesting updates from specific people. And but I made sure to highlight it again in the analysis because it was important to sort of call out that work that may have been missed had I not brought it up again. And another problem we came across was core functionalities decisions changing after engineering teams were already working on them. Obviously, that slows down the ability to release a feature when you're on a crunch timeline. So again, aligning expectations with leadership that the core functionality decision should be complete by the time it gets to engineers actually building it. And here's some examples of process work outside of the SDLC. So I established and led monthly observability meetings for the system I supported, and shared monthly trend summaries to highlight potential reliability and performance issues, creating on-call run books to improve incident response efficiency, even creating like an office hours to improve collaboration, dependency management, and reducing rework because the system that I was supporting was utilized by a large amount of the rest of the engineering teams. And there was a pretty big dependency web there. So just having office hours where people could submit topics, ask questions about whether there were things that they need to consider with features they were working on. And again, using that impact-driven language. So when you're creating additional collaboration processes, what you're really doing is establishing regular feedback loops and reducing dependency oversight, identifying blockers early. All these things lead to faster feature development. Creating on-call runbooks that improves response efficiency, so it leads to quicker resolutions because engineers and responders have the ability to sort of go through a checklist of what they need to look at. Establishing standardized practices that leads to reduced rework and faster development cycles and higher quality releases. And then the third pillar is test architecture. So I know that testers have various levels of coding experience or what people think of when they think about test architecture. And obviously, the tech stack and scripting is one way to impact that area, but it's not the only way. I personally consider myself a dabbler when it comes to coding. Everything I've learned has been in a work context, typically through, solving a problem I stumble across. But there are a lot of ways that we can provide input here because at the end of the day, we're the experts on what quality means. We are the experts on software quality as a whole, and that includes, with test architecture, even if you're not writing scripts yourself. So some questions to ask, have you ever provided consultation on test automation, like, you know, going through and talking about testing at the different levels, unit tests versus integration tests versus end-to-end tests. Have you done test suite audits? Have you ever investigated testability or test environment issues? Even mapping out dependencies or researching and proposing new frameworks to implement, those sorts of things. Again, I wanted to share some examples I've done myself. So I kind of split them into two categories. One is the more technical, the other one is less technical. So the more technical examples are researching tooling and writing like a proof of concept to adopt an open source performance test automation tool. And I wrote a couple of sample test scripts. Even researching and just offering a solution for adding additional testing. So like we had closed network APIs and wanted to add some synthetic tests to those closed network APIs, but the engineers didn't really have time to think about that. So I did some research and figured out we were just missing a very small piece that we needed to add to our APIs moving forward to be able to test them. I also collaborated with an engineer to write a script to pull code coverage data and categorize it and then visualize it through Google Looker as part of like a project I created to increase code coverage and the quality of code coverage. I think one thing to really highlight is none of this work ever happened in a vacuum. Like I wasn't doing this solo. I was relying on the collaboration of the teams I was working with and the people I was working with and the relationships I had built with engineers and asking a lot of questions all the time. Some less technical examples. So investigating testability issues in a test environment. I think I was looking into, I supported the billing system and we were looking to see why we couldn't use Stripe test clocks. Because it wasn't propagating across all these other microservices. And so all I did was essentially look at what are the API calls that are happening in our production environment versus like our lower environments. And I found a few missing API calls and I just shared that solution. Test suite audits. So I would, review tests that engineers would write in their PRs, and was talking about, our test strategy as a whole, how we wanted to really focus on unit tests and integration tests because of the system that we were working in. And then I also audited like our end-to-end test suite to see if the tests we were writing and deploying in our pipeline every time we deployed something were actually valuable, which a couple weren't. They were not written at the right level. They should have been written at a lower level versus at a higher and more expensive level. Um, Consulting with the DevOps team. So they asked us for our input on test architecture improvements like ephemeral environments and resettable data and things like that. Um, and highlighting code quality opportunities like removing dead code to reduce risk and create a less complex code base. Mapping out dependencies and technical architecture to user experience. Um, One example with that is I designed like a performance section in an observability tool we use to show all of the APIs that were a part of like a user's checkout experience. So we could actually see the performance of the experience as a whole instead of as individual APIs. And again, using that impact-driven language. So you're providing those test suite audits or consultation, you're optimizing testing coverage through quality subject matter expert consultation, leading to reduced deployment time, more reliable releases, and reduced regression issues. Investigating testability and test environment issues drives faster feedback cycles and feature development through mitigation of testability issues. Mapping out dependencies can improve system understanding and cross-functional collaboration, leading to higher quality releases and faster feature development. The big thing is to layer the quantitative data with the qualitative data as much as you can. Kind of want to interplay it more because people like to see numbers, especially leaders. If you're using that impact-driven language, that can really help drive the point home. And then communicate as often as possible within the impact framework you developed. So I just gave an example of the impact framework I developed for myself of like my 3 pillars, but it can be whatever makes sense for you. And then find opportunities to communicate. Monthly updates, feature releases, different touch points through the SDLC, writing executive summaries, asking for feedback a lot. All of those things can be opportunities to communicate more. And say it as often as you can, at as many levels as you can. And experiment with different ways to share and visualize the story until you find the best way that communicates the impact you're driving. I think that's the biggest thing is, the first way may not work, the 10th way may not work, but you keep trying until you find a way that resonates with whatever your audience is. And it could be different for your different levels of audience. That's important to continue to experiment until you find the right way. And that's it. Sorry if I talked a little fast.
No, it was
It was
awesome. Don't feel
perfect.
that way at all. I'm gonna stop recording because I have something really I want to say, and we don't need that later.